That would definitely be the starting point, would be to look at the company document, whether it's a bylaws or an operating agreement. That needs to have a plan that needs to spell out what's to happen in the event of the death of a spouse, of a partner, the incapacity, or even divorce of a business partner. I mean, we don't want to find ourselves in business with an ex-spouse either.
You're listening to Legal Skinny Podcast with Trisha Barita. I'm a 15-year licensed practicing attorney in the state of Texas. I created Legal Skinny because when I've been invited to do educational seminars on different subjects in employment law, employers and HR professionals would often ask me, where can they find out a little more information on this or a little more information on that? Look, I get it. There's a lot of resources out there, but sometimes it's confusing and people are so busy. Sometimes people have only 30 or 15 or maybe even 5 minutes in their day to devote to learning something new. On this podcast, you'll hear me have discussions and interviews on topics relevant to employers. Disclaimer though, Legal Skinny is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice and doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction. So this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you. The leaders and HR practitioners in a business may run into pitfalls when they have not given thought to the planning pieces of how a business will move forward. These plans can include items such as the practical next steps pieces of what happens when the owners, leaders of the company may no longer be able to lead, and who is next to take the reins of the company. It may also include succession planning for different roles in the company by identifying the particular skills for that role and preparing certain individuals to perform those functions. And it could also include identifying the specific individuals to replace key operating functions as needed. This type of forward thinking is not limited to large, sophisticated companies, but can be a thoughtful and strategic way for any company to plan for the future. Today, my guest is both a friend and fellow colleague, Joy McNair. Joy is a licensed practicing attorney and owner of her own law firm from the McNair Law Group, PLC in the state of Texas. Her legal practice includes wills and trusts, estate planning, asset protection, and legacy planning. She's licensed to practice in Texas, Georgia, and the District of Columbia. Her law degree is from Howard University School of Law in D.C., and she has a Master's of Law from Georgetown University Law Center in D.C. with a concentration in taxation and a certificate in estate planning. She does have a busy practice here in Texas, but when she has free time, she enjoys attending concerts or the symphony with family and friends. Since my topic is to plan or not to plan, that is the question, I wanted to tap into Joy's thoughts on the matter, as she's one of my favorite advocates for having a good plan and could give insight to why employers and businesses in general should consider the benefits of planning. We had a great conversation, and so I hope you enjoy this Legal Skinny episode of To Plan or Not to Plan. That is the question. Welcome to the Legal Skinny Podcast, Joy. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Oh, thanks so much for that introduction, Trisha. I've told you before how proud of you I am and how much I admire what you've been able to accomplish in this space. And I'm just glad to be part of it and to just be able to contribute what I can.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. So I've given my listeners a little bit, of course, background on your work, but go ahead and tell them a little bit about not just your work, but sort of kind of what led you down this path and this career choice.
Sure, sure. So I host a lot of estate planning workshops, and I have this wise story that I like to share that a lot of my guests enjoy hearing. And really, the passion of mine roots back to childhood when I lost my father. He was one of the 7 astronauts that perished on board the Challenger space shuttle. And I was very young at the time, so I spent a great deal of time, the majority of my life, experienced many of the things that we have to contend with when we lose a loved one. And so this is something that I've been exposed to for quite a bit amount of time. And so I've seen it. As a firsthand, and I've also seen it as a professional working with families and knowing, what happens when families get the planning correctly and when they don't. And my father's story is more of a traditional sense of estate planning, what people think about death and dying and transitioning their assets to the next generation. But there's another aspect that a lot of people don't take enough time to consider, and that's incapacity. And that's where my mother's story plays a role. And she ended up several years ago now, she had to have an emergency craniotomy brain surgery. She had developed an infection that traveled to her brain and it formed an abscess, and it required a major surgery to be released, a brain surgery to be released. And during the surgery, she had suffered respiratory failure. She had to be hooked up to a ventilator. Followed by complications afterwards. She had swelling of the brain and was in a medical coma for 3 weeks, and then had to go through neurological rehab for several months. And so during that time, she was incapacitated. It was completely unexpected to us, but she was not able to manage her finances. She couldn't manage her health care. There were various things that she unexpectedly was no longer able to do. While it was a small period of time, it was still somebody needed to be able to step in there and take care of those matters for her. And fortunately, she had the various documents that were required. But during that process, her physician commented on how grateful she was to see a family that had it together. She doesn't always see families that are so organized with their information and their decision making. And I just smiled and let her know that that's my life's work, helping families through what I like to call life's box of chocolates. If you recall from Forrest Gump, life's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And that's absolutely true. I mean, so oftentimes we make plans for the good things, but we have to also have a plan in place in the event that something unfortunate happens, whether it's becoming incapacitated, not able to manage your legal and financial affairs. But also for when you pass away, we have to have a plan to transition. And I really like the topic that we're focusing on business owners here as well, because as a business owner myself, that's something we think about, what's going to happen to our business, to our assets, to our staff. And so I'm very happy to be here to speak on that subject. But that's a little bit about my passion and how I got started here.
Yeah, clearly, your story, we've known each other for quite a while now, but your story, giving you this purpose, it just seems so fitting, Joy, that you do what you do. And I know that you really can relate and help them through sort of, what this looks like on the other end when you don't plan and how they can kind of take steps and really make a difference and what it looks like just, in the overall picture and everyone that is involved when there is no plan. And how unfortunate that can be in certain circumstances. So today we're hoping that doesn't happen to anyone listening, because we're going to talk about planning, right?
Absolutely.
So let's start with a broad perspective. So, depending on what state you're on, if you're listening, we're both in Texas, so we'll just start from the Texas perspective. Joy, from what is the issue that could happen, or possible issues potentially for businesses that have, let's say, no plan, nothing in the bylaws, nothing in their maybe limited liability company agreements, talking about what would happen if one of the business owners should pass away or become incapacitated?
Sure. Well, that's a really good question. So on the broadest issue that we see a lot is access to the accounts. It's in particular an issue if there's just a sole proprietor or sole owner of the business. When somebody passes away, accounts are frozen. And nobody can access those accounts until you have to go through a court process known as probate. And so that process does take a bit of time to go through for the judge to be able to validate a will if there is one. If not, we have to go through a whole process for the court to be able to authorize an administrator to be able to access the accounts. In the meantime, there could be vendors. What's going to happen to the clients? What's going to happen? Is the staff going to be able to be paid if there were staff on board? And so we see that issue a lot when we have really it's a bigger issue when there's just a sole business owner. And so that's a big issue. Another issue we have to contend with is who's going to manage the business, who's going to take over leadership. And a lot of that really depends on the structure of the business. Again, if it's a sole proprietor, is there somebody trained to be able to step up and take over management? Will they know where the accounts are? Will they know who to contact? Is there a plan in place for notifying clients or customers, patients, whomever, about either the death or incapacity of the business owner? For professional services, there's another layer of issues. Professional services such as law practices, such as we have, or medical practices. If there are psychologists who are in private practice, insurance, a lot of those have to have special licensing for somebody to be able to step in and wind up that aspect, because there's HIPAA if it's in the medical, there's the attorney-client privilege, there's a lot of confidential information. And so we need to make sure that somebody's able to step in and wind up that practice and then be able to transition clients, customers, patients, whatever the classification is, so that they can find a new professional to be able to provide the services to them. Another issue that we see as well with partnerships, that's a big issue. If there's more than one business owner and one person passes away, what's going to happen, number one, to the business? Will the business owners suddenly find themselves in business with the family of the deceased?
Right. Well, that's not thought of usually at the beginning of a business. You think, well, I like, so-and-so's wife or husband. All right. We've had, dinner together, but you don't think, oh my God, we're now making decisions about my business.
In the estate planning community, we always say a business needs to have a prenuptial agreement, just like a marriage. Everything's great in the beginning, but then sometimes when situations change, you wish you would have spelled out things a little bit better. And so the same can be said for a business as well. We need to know what's going to happen. Is the business owner, do they want it to stay in the family, the business to stay in the family? Is there a family member that's able to step in? Or is the business or the business, the partners going to reacquire the business? And if so, how are they going to go about doing that? And so we need to have that spelled out, what's going to happen in that regards. But that's an issue when it's not, because like we said, we end up being in business, having unexpected business partners.
Yeah. And it's you make a good point, right? So sign those agreements when everyone's in love, whether it's the business owners that are all starting the business together, or they're at least in a, happy place. Because, just like, in the marriage issues, right? Just like you say, Joy, when that breakdown does happen, there's no renegotiating that. So whatever you left out, you left out.
Mm-hmm. And it needs to happen. It needs to spell out both in the event of the death of the business owner or the incapacity, because that's something that can happen as well, just as easily.
True. Good point. So, okay. So we've talked about some of these problems that you can have. So now, going forward, and say there is no plan, where could they get started with the plan? Where should they look? I mean, should they look to their company documents to get started, or where do you think that they should start if there is no plan?
Sure. So that would definitely be the starting point, would be to look at the company document, whether it's a bylaws or an operating agreement. That needs to have a plan that needs to spell out what's to happen in the event of the death of a spouse, of a partner, the incapacity, or even divorce of a business partner. I mean, we don't want to find ourselves in business with an ex-spouse either. And so that would be the first place that we would look at. From there, a lot of my business owner clients look at doing buy-sell agreements as well. They want to make sure that perhaps the equity goes to the family and the business or the business partners can acquire the actual shares or interest in the business. And so a buy-sell agreement would spell out those provisions. And oftentimes they're funded by life insurance as well, so that there's some liquidity there to buy back the partner's interest.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's talk a little bit about that for people that aren't familiar with that. So if the buy sell, so what Joy's kind of referencing is there's some sort of agreement that so say it's like say two members of an LLC, really common here in Texas. They're friends. They both are married. One of them passes away, and then the spouse, okay, can the spouse's share of the business be bought out? And how does that work with life insurance is what you were saying, is Joy.
Sure, right. So So you framed that very well. And so a lot of times they'll use the life insurance to have the liquidity there, to have the money there to be able to buy out for the surviving business owners to buy the deceased business owner's share. So they can have the business, but the family can still have the value, the equity, the money there, the financial interest of the deceased business owner.
So it can end up taking care of everybody in that way, if you think about it.
Absolutely. And then from there, once we establish the equity component, then we need to figure out, well, then who is it going to go to? And so that's when the more traditional estate planning comes in. Whether it's a trust, I do think that most business owners need to have some form of trust. All business owners need to have some form of trust, whether it's a revocable or irrevocable. Those are beyond the scope of what we'll discuss today. That's a case by case analysis. But business owners need to consider having some sort of trust that can really govern from that point who's going to receive their assets and the interest in their business. Number one, it prevents it from having to go through the court process, from having accounts frozen, from having limited access to the business. And then also they can control really who's going to receive their assets and in what amount, just to make sure that your life's work isn't squandered. You worked really hard to build your business, to accomplish the equity and the value that you have in the business, and you want to make sure that that's protected and transition to your loved ones in the most efficient and smoothest way possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you talk a little more about that, Joy, as to what steps need to be taken to get to the point where you need a trust? What do you need to have? Do you need to have a certain amount of equity in the business?
No, not necessarily. It's not based on the amount of equity that you have or the value of an estate. Just by virtue of having a business, it's worth it to not have to go through that probate process. If it's just maybe a very small, maybe there's just a bank account and you can add somebody on it for a sole proprietor. But if there's an LLC, a corporation, any of those formal entities, you definitely would benefit from having some form of trust.
And let's talk about if you have the buy-sell agreement and you have no insurance, the problem with that.
How are you going to pay for it? Now, sometimes there is enough liquidity for the partners to do that. But in a lot of cases, if you're talking about buying somebody out at several $100,000 or even several $1 million, the funds need to come from somewhere. And that's why the life insurance is usually coupled with that, just to make sure that there's that money there to be able to make that purchase.
Yeah, that can be a very bad misstep where it was good intentions that they would buy out the spouse, but there's no money because, and in order to get the money would require to basically, liquefy the business. So
right.
Which would defeat the whole purpose of the person that wants the business to move on and allow them to go. So,
so that's why it's important really to follow through with all components of a plan. A lot of times people will sign an agreement and they're excited because they're done, but there's oftentimes additional steps that you need to follow through, like funding a buy-sell agreement, whether it's life insurance or making sure that you have those funds allocated some way.
Yeah, and I think that's all really good solid starting places for individuals. Do you think, Joy, too, that they should follow up with this plan to make sure it's still accurate a couple years after the business has started?
Absolutely. That's something that needs to be looked at periodically. I say at a minimum every 3 to 5 years, plans need to be revisited because relationships change. There could be new business owners that are new partners that have been brought in. There could be partners that have stepped down. And so you just need to make sure, and then the value of the business can change. You have adequate amount of insurance to fund the buy sell as well. So that's something that would need to be revisited periodically.
Yeah, that's a great point on the end. Certainly, if you get an insurance policy and it's too low and then the business takes off, but all good things to be thinking about. On one last note, I wanted to kind of talk to you about this, and this is you and me, business owner to business owner, and me, I deal with a lot more employers on a regular basis doing employment law versus, all the different areas you do with wills and trusts and estates. One concern that recently has come up with planning that I think employers are running into, especially in the midst of COVID-19, is that all of a sudden employees aren't that would normally always be available to work are becoming unavailable to work for various reasons related to COVID-19, whether they have to take care of children or whether they are sick themselves or family members sick and they need to care for them. And we're talking about potentially key employees. Kind of let's talk a little bit about what maybe businesses could do in the planning process to sort of rethink that.
Sure. So I approach this from the perspective of an estate planning attorney, and I hope to not sound like I'm admonishing anybody. This comes from a loving place, but really, in my opinion, is that really this should not necessarily be treated any different than pre-COVID. I understand that COVID has really brought a greater awareness, but in reality, COVID or not COVID, any key employee can become sick, become incapacitated, can pass away at any time. So we need to have some form of contingency plans in place for key employees anyway. One thing that we're very big components of in my practice is really making sure that everything is systematized. I'm a big fan of Michael Gerber's E-Myth, that believes in just systematizing businesses and having things documented. That way, if the key employee is not able to perform, isn't able to come in for any reason, there's at least some documented instructions about how to do certain key functions. Of course, you can't replicate the employee in their entirety, but it could close some gaps or at least lessen the learning curve if you have to train somebody new on some of those key functions. And so that's something that we're big at in my office, and we've been really diligent about trying to go back and update those due to COVID because certain things change. But I think that's really big for a lot of businesses. It's just to make sure people know, number one, are very clear about what their roles and abilities are, and that there's something documented that can be referenced.
I think that's such good advice. I think also looking at when you're looking at a big span, and we're talking about if you have an employer that has hundreds of employees versus an employer that has less than 100 employees or less than 50 employees, and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I know who are the key employees? I kind of always say, look to, if you had to replace these individuals right now, whether because of COVID or, like you said, Joy, making a good point, just could occur anyway, right? Whether they leave, right, to the competitor or somewhere else or whatever. If you had to replace them right now, what is the learning curve to get someone else into that position? And what is the experience level that you need? So if there's not a lot of people out on the market with that experience level, is it going to be difficult for you to replace them? So how can you systemize that, like you said, Joy, and sort of one thing I would say with employers is, for a planning perspective, is to start with knowing what everybody does. Because if you don't know what they do and then they're gone, it's just like juggling balls. Because you're right. Oh, I didn't know Joe was handling that.
Job descriptions come into play too. Very clear job descriptions.
Yeah. And sometimes, I've seen it where employers like, well, Susie has so many hats. Susie's the office manager. Susie handles, parts of the HR pieces. Susie has all these pieces. Should we have multiple job descriptions? No, like really at some point you got to go, this is what Susie does. She's not multiple people. But could Susie be replaced by multiple people if you were in a pinch? You know what I mean? Maybe
Sure.
so, right?
Or maybe for larger companies, different people can be cross-trained on some of Susie's functions in case Susie's not able to be there.
Yeah. And I think that plays into in your planning theme as well as you're always a planner. I know this of you.
Big planner.
I love that about you. You inspire all planning all the time. But I think with kind of going through and thinking that forward, while they should have always been thinking it, certainly more employers are now seeing, oh my gosh, like, I didn't ever expect this. This is the employee that never takes any vacation, right? Sure. That employee, that's the loyal employee. They've been with you for 10 to 15 years. All of a sudden, their husband is sick or they're sick or something, major is causing them not to be there in the workforce. And that forward thinking of how you're going to handle that situation could really make or break whether or not you're going to do well in the economy against your competitors, if you're going to have that huge piece missing. So it's not too late to start that planning now. Look at those job descriptions. Get on it.
Look at the job descriptions or document some steps, or even have the employee just record their screen as they're performing some of the key functions, just so that there's something documented on some of those key provisions.
Yeah. And what kind of experience, really thinking about what kind of experience would be necessary if you were in a position of having to replace those individuals. And it could be in a broader sense, even in where you're not, while you're always trying to plan for the worst, planning for the best. What if you want to bring that employee up, right, and move them up in the company? Then you still are going to have to replace them, and you still need to know what they're doing, and you still need to be able to go, okay, we need these types of people. We're going to need this amount of time to get them up on learning curve, and these type of systems and the training, and having a real visual picture of that, until you wait till the moment when the person is gone because of it. A bad reason, or you're trying to bring them up, maybe put them in a higher management position because another position opens up. If you're already looking ahead going, we're going to need at least 3 months lead time to get someone up to speed for this position, it can really help in the long term for you to overall plan. And so I think that kind of definitely, go ahead, Joy.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, just piggyback on what you're saying. I think it's very important to be realistic as well about what it's going to take to onboard an employee, especially in a key position as well. And so that's something that needs to be part of the overall plan.
Are you you're thinking half glass full is not the way to go? I could definitely get this person up to speed in 2 weeks, and it's much more difficult.
And it's probably more of a 6 months job. I mean, just understanding that.
Yeah, I think being realistic in this point of view is the only way to not put pressure on everybody, including the person that's trying to step into that role. You're almost setting it up for a failure position if you don't give them enough time for them to sort of grow. And that's with any, of course, new employee, but certainly when you're trying to develop an employee to a new position or bring in someone that has experience and they just need the training to know how your company does it, right? Being realistic is a good thought. That's a good point, Joy. So this was like really great information. I loved our discussion on planning. I know you and I could go on and plan, but I really enjoyed you joining me today. Do you mind if we do the legal skinny rundown before we wrap up?
Sure.
Okay. Are you ready?
Let's do it. Let's go.
Okay. Beach or mountains?
Beach for sure. I'd like to be on one right now.
Right? Elvis or the Beatles?
Definitely the Beatles.
Most influential book you've read?
Oh gosh, there's so many. One of my all-time favorites is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. It's kind of cliche, but you gotta love that book.
Love that. Okay. Dead or alive, what famous person would you invite to dinner?
Don't judge me for this one. Nikola Tesla. I'm pretty nerdy, and I'm just fascinated by his work. I would love to meet Tesla.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. And then finally, in 1 minute or less, what is the skinny on planning for the future with a business?
Oh, I think there's so much opportunity here for business owners on so many different levels. I mean, there's a lot of tax planning opportunities that that they can benefit from. There's asset protection, making sure that your business is protected from your personal life, and that your personal life is protected from your business. There's a lot of different things that we can do in the asset protection arena for business owners. And then just the succession planning, making sure that your business has an estate plan and can properly transition in the event that you become incapacitated or pass away. There's just a lot of different things that business owners can do, and really should consider it, especially in these uncertain times. We're making it a higher up on their priority list to visit, because there's so much they can do.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone wants to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Oh, they can call my office at 281-407-9830. It's 281-407-9830, or they can email support@mcnairlawgroup.com, and somebody from my team will be happy to assist them.
Thanks again, Joy, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And that's the Legal Skinny on to plan or not to plan. That is the question. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Legal Skinny podcast. Do not forget to subscribe to get future podcast episodes. Also, check out legalskinny.com to join our newsletter and get details on all the educational resources we offer the employer. Also, disclaimer, remember Legal Skinny is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Laws change or they differ by jurisdiction. So also remember, this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.